constructing this preaching series back in December, I had no idea that the Sunday I planned to speak about Daniel was the Sunday of Martin Luther King's birthday. I love divine surprises like that. So this series of 2 sermons, really, Esther last week, Daniel this week, was for me responding in both a pastoral and prophetic way to the anxiety that I run into on the street all the time. And so last week we talked about Esther, because I think it's always a time for courage. It's always a time for courage. And so let me just recap Esther. Esther, the story of Esther tells, opens up with, we're in the court of the king of Persia, and he's drinking with all his buddies, and he calls for his wife Vashti to come and dance for them all, and she just completely, flat out refuses. And you know what happens when the women refuse the king, right? Well, it wasn't so bad for her in this story. She just got kicked out of the palace, right? So he had to find another queen, and there was a man within his court named Mordecai who was Jewish. And you need to know that the book of Esther never mentions the word God once. Isn't that curious? So Mordecai was in the court, and he had a cousin Esther who was very, very attractive. And so he convinced her to be part of the beauty pageant that was part of the process for coming up with the new queen. And yet at the same time warned her that her identity needed to remain secret. Well, lo and behold, she wins the beauty contest. She ends up being the wife of the king. And then as time unfolds, there's this man named Haman who's very racist. He hates the Jews. He creates a plot to annihilate the Jews. Mordecai gets word of this plot. And in fact, he gets the king to in some backhanded way to support this plot. So Mordecai's freaking out in the palace, and he sends word to the queen, because of course she's the queen now, he can't just show up, saying, look, you've got to do something about this. You've got to go and speak to the king and try and sabotage this plot. But Esther reminds him that you can't just go speak to the king. You have to be invited to speak to the king. And if you go uninvited and he doesn't hand his scepter out to you, you all remember this from Sunday school, right? It's just a great story. If he doesn't hold his scepter out to you, right, then you off with your head. So she gets back to him and says, look, I'd be putting my life on the line if I were to just go and speak to the king. And then I think one of my favorite lines in the whole biblical text, Mordecai responds to her and says, Esther, how do you know it was not for such a time as this that you were made queen? And so she summons the courage. And she goes to the king, and he hands out his scepter to her, and she invites him and Haman to a luncheon, and she exposes the plot, and her people are saved. So that's a great female story of courage, and so I thought we better balance it out with a really good male story of courage. So the story of Daniel just seemed to be really obvious. So both of these stories are set in a context of exile, all right? So the Jewish people have been taken from their homeland in Jerusalem. And the larger theological question that is addressed within these particular stories is, wow, now that we no longer live in Jerusalem, with the temple there and our priests there and this promised land that we have our feet on, all of these things are signs that God is on our side and God is present and God is going to look after us. All right, that was the theology. And then suddenly, bam, Babylonians come along, tape all the elites out of the country, demolish the temple, and then you have all of these theologians living in exile going, whoa, well, so now what are we going to say about God? And it's interesting because then what arises are very different narratives that in fact hand back the practice of courage and power to the people. All right? So then we end up with saints like Esther and like Daniel. And it's looking at these stories that we have to think again. What does it mean to be a people of the Spirit? Another great story. Darius, the king of Babylon, put 3 officials in charge of his kingdom, and one of these officials was Daniel, a Jew. Daniel did his work so much better than the other officials that the king decided to let him govern the whole kingdom. The other men tried to find something wrong with the way Daniel did his work for the king, so they went to the king and said, "Your Majesty, you should make a law forbidding anyone to pray to any god or human except for you for the next 30 days. Everyone who disobeys this law must be thrown into a pit of lions." So Darius made the law. Daniel heard about the law, but still knelt down in prayer 3 times a day, giving thanks to God. The officials who had spoken to the king and saw him praying to his God for help then told the king. That Jew named Daniel, who was brought here as a captive, refuses to obey the law that you ordered and still prays to his God 3 times a day. So Darius ordered Daniel to be thrown into a pit of lions, but he said to Daniel, "You have been faithful to your God, and I pray that he will rescue you." At daybreak, the king got up and ran to the pit. He shouted, "Daniel, you were faithful and saved by your God. Was he able to save you from the lions?" Daniel answered, "Your Majesty, my God knew that I was innocent and sent an angel to keep the lions from eating me." All went well for Daniel while Darius was king. I've done a lot of thinking this week about 4 conversations that unfolded in this week alone that involved people expressing to me that they were not comfortable about my speaking politics in church. So I think I need to address that first, and it's interesting that it comes on this particular Sunday. We have in this sanctuary 3 images that represent, I think, the finest of this spiritual tradition, that remind us that civil disobedience and speaking truth to power is an integral part of the Judaic Christian tradition. Let's start up here. It's a really tiny one, but you can see right in the center the burning bush. Burning bush actually is the symbol of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. The burning bush marks the doorway through which the prophet Moses was invited to walk, that involved returning to Egypt and challenging the Pharaoh to let his people go. It is a foundational story for those who are members of the Jewish tradition. It is foundational for us. And it's a very, very political story. Second, we have Daniel in the lion's den way back in the corner. Again, it is a story of civil disobedience, a little different. Daniel didn't go and face the king and demand that the law be changed because it was unjust and oppressive. He just ignored the law and determined that no earthly power or edict was going to prevent him from living out of a different set of core values and under a larger banner of authority. And the tradition praised him for that. He is a hero of this tradition. And finally, that image right over there of Jesus in the garden, where that story is meant to provide some sort of insight into the decisions that Jesus made in the final days of his life. And there are a number of options that he had. He could have left Jerusalem, the seat of religious and political power, gone back, continued to kind of walk the dusty roads of Galilee, healing a few lepers, eating with a few prostitutes, challenging a few local rabbis. But he chose instead to face the power that existed in Jerusalem, knowing full well that when he went up against that power, there would be consequences. And we know well what those consequences were. You don't mess with power without consequences. Then, now. Which is why courage is so desperately needed if we are to live faithfully out of this tradition. So I need to suggest that if you have required the support of the medical system within the last year, anyone required the support of the medical system in the last year, and it has not been followed by a bill of at least 4 figures, then you are, in fact, more comfortable than you think with the mixture of politics and religion. Because one of the reasons that we do not get those bills once we have been treated, and I'm not saying we have a perfect system, you don't hear me say that, but we have a system because of a very feisty Baptist preacher from southern Saskatchewan who made no bones about speaking truth to power. And he wasn't always nice about it, though he was nice. But you can recall some of his speeches that we heard when, in fact, Canada made him their favorite Canadian out of that entire series, right? His I think this may not be a word. Oratorial gifts? Oratorial? I was practicing it last night. It didn't sound right. Put an L at the end. Oratorial gifts. Referring to those in power as the fat cats, right? And the vulnerable as the mice. Whew. Thank goodness for the prophets in our community, like Tommy Douglas. I have also in the last week been involved in conversations around affordable housing and elementary school education and health care, which are all conversations brewing in the county right now, and if they haven't already become political, they are going to become political. So we have Moses, and we have Daniel, and we have Jesus, and we have Tommy Douglas, and we have Martin Luther King Jr. And the bigger question I think we need to ask ourselves when dealing with our own discomfort around the discussion of power in church is this. Why are the Tommy Douglases and the Martin Luther King Jr.'s the exception to the rule within our tradition when they are clearly standing on some significant saints within this tradition that are cheering them on? Why is it that a great big Christian country like Canada, where the Lord's Prayer was said in every school, would consider Tommy Douglas to be a bit of a radical? Why is it that a great big Christian country like the U.S., with "In God We Trust" printed on their currency, would consider Martin Luther King to be an outlaw? Well, we've talked about that. We have talked about when the Jesus movement, after the baptism of the Emperor Constantine, became a tool for political power, became a tool of the emperor. Good. None of those crazy Christians getting people to think weird and crazy. We're just going to make them the church. Everyone has to believe the same thing, and then I can continue to control them all really well. And by and large, still on, the church and state for centuries reinforced one another's power. This became all too clear in this country with the revelations of how the church supported the state's initiative to annihilate indigenous culture through residential schools. So the church couldn't speak truth to power because the church either was in bed with power or was power. By and large, the leaders of Christendom were also the elite. And so if you grew up in this tradition, it is unlikely that you heard much of this, because much of the tradition, the Christian tradition, focused instead on personal sin and inviting you to be a better person. Furthermore, and this is a bit of a different take, but while I'm speaking some truth about how the church tended to function, not only was it not prepared to speak to power, it had developed this puritanical sense whereby no one was really encouraged to speak the truth about themselves. So if you suffered from mental illness, or if you're an alcoholic, or if you were pregnant and not married, or if you were a victim of domestic violence, well, by and large, you were considered a sinner at worst and charity at best. Anyway, I digress. What differentiates the Judaic Christian tradition from other spiritual traditions is its perspective that we are restored when we are restored to community, when the table is extended to make room for the stranger, the leper, the widow, the child, when God's abundance is available to all genders, races, classes. Esther stuck out her neck to save her people from the oppression of racism. Daniel stood his ground in the midst of a life-threatening circumstances and insisted that no man would be his God. Nina Turner, a Democratic senator who has been equally critical of her own party, as she should be, spoke yesterday, marking the occasion of Martin Luther King's birthday. I encourage you to go and look at it on YouTube. She says, and she's a black woman and her roots are in the South, "We cannot have testimony without a test. And we are being tested right now for whether or not we've got courage enough, hope enough, fight enough, and love enough to do what is necessary." Those words will never get old. Those words are central to our tradition. She continued to say, we can have finite disappointment, but we must have infinite hope. So this tradition says that infinite hope is possible when we walk the road together. Infinite hope is possible when we are armed with compassion for ourselves and one another. Infinite hope is possible when we stand on the shoulders of the saints. Oh, I know, it's too bad the reformers threw that word out. We've got to have it front and center. We are not in this alone. when we stand on the shoulders of the saints who taught us that the practice of courage will defeat the powers of death that lurk within us and outside of us. It is always time to be courageous. It is always time to be fueled by compassion. We have in Martin Luther King a very real human being, but also one of the finest prophets of our tradition, who continues to provide hope and empowerment so many people. He lived and spoke in the tradition of Esther, who got behind her courage, and Daniel, who said, I will call no man God. And Jesus, who said, there's a price I'm going to pay, but I'm prepared to pay it in order that compassion and courage and justice might rise again and again. I'm going to play for you the theme song of the movie Selma that told about the march to Selma, Alabama. The fight on this particular occasion was for the African American people to become registered voters, and the system was just dogging those attempts at every opportunity. This piece of music called Glory, I think, is a spectacular reflection, along with some of the footage from the movie, the power of collective courage and compassion.
One day, when the glory comes, it will be ours, it will be ours. Oh, one day, when the war is won, we will be sure, we will be sure. Oh, glory, glory, glory. Oh, to the heavens, no man, no weapon formed against, yes, glory is destined. Everyday women and men become legends. Sins that go against our skin become blessings. The movement is a rhythm to us. Freedom is like religion to us. Justice is juxtaposition in us. Justice for all just ain't specific enough. One son died, the spirit is revisiting us. True and living in us. Resistance is us. That's why Rosa sat on the bus. That's why we walk through Ferguson with our hands up. When it go down, we woman and man up. They say stay down, and we stand up. Shots, we on the ground. The camera panned up. King pointed to the mountaintop, and we ran up. One day, when the glory comes, it will be ours, it will be ours. Oh, one day, when the war is won, we will be sure, we will be sure. Oh, glory, glory, glory. Now the war is not over, victory isn't won, but we'll fight on to the finish, and then when it's all done, we'll cry glory, oh glory, oh, we'll cry glory, oh glory, oh. Selma is now for every man, woman, and child. Even Jesus got his crown in front of a crowd. They march with the torch, we gon' run with it now. Never look back, we done gone hundreds of miles. From dark roads, heroes, to become a hero. Facing the League of Justice, his power was the people. Enemy is lethal, a king became regal. Saw the face of Jim Crow under a bald ego. The biggest weapon is to stay peaceful. We sing, our music is the cuts that we bleed through. Somewhere in the dream we had an epiphany. epiphany. Now we right the wrongs in history. No one can win a war individually. It take the wisdom of the elders and young people's energy. Welcome to the story we call victory. The coming of the Lord, my eyes have seen the glory.
One day, when the glory comes, it will be ours. It will be ours. Oh, one day, when the war is won, we will be sure. We will be sure. Oh, glory. When the war is won, when it's all said and done, we'll cry glory. Oh, glory.